Welcome back to Twisted Tales, the channel where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. The story we have for you today is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most desperate acts are born from the deepest pain. It's a story of love, betrayal, and the terrifying breaking point of a human soul. Before we journey to the blood-soaked hills of a remote rubber plantation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you don't miss out on our weekly explorations of the shadows. Now, settle in, as we unravel the tragic tale of a young wife, an abusive husband, and a love that turned deadly. The air on the plantation was always thick, a cloying cocktail of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, almost sour scent of raw latex. For 19-year-old May, it was the smell of her life, the very air she had breathed since she was a child. But lately, another, more metallic and sinister, scent seemed to cling to the humid air, the scent of fear. It was a fear that had a name, Bao. May had married Bao a year ago. It had been an arrangement, a practicality. Her family, poor and with too many mouths to feed, had seen it as a good match. Bao was older, in his late 30s, and owned a small but productive plot of land on the sprawling rubber plantation. He was a man of some standing, respected for his tireless work ethic and the steady flow of income he generated from the milky white sap of his trees. To her parents, he was a provider, a solid and dependable future for their youngest daughter. To May, in the beginning, he was a stranger, a man whose hands were calloused and whose smiles rarely reached his eyes. Their wedding had been a simple affair, a small gathering of family and a handful of Bao's friends from the plantation. May had worn a borrowed dress, a size too big, and had kept her eyes downcast, a picture of demure obedience. She had hoped for kindness, for a gentle hand to guide her into this new life. What she received was a gruff indifference that, over time, curdled into a quiet, simmering cruelty. The first few months were a blur of hard work and quiet evenings. May would wake before the sun, preparing a simple breakfast of rice porridge and pickled vegetables. While Bao was out in the groves, his tapping knife a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound in the pre-dawn stillness, May would tend to their small wooden house. It was a simple structure, raised on stilts, with a corrugated tin roof that amplified the sound of the frequent rainstorms into a deafening roar. She would sweep the dirt floor, wash their meager collection of clothes in a plastic basin, and prepare the midday meal, which she would then carry out to him in the shade of a large banyan tree at the edge of his plot. In those early days, his words were few, his touches rare and functional. He would eat in silence, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his mind seemingly occupied with the price of rubber, the threat of leaf disease, or the 100 other worries of a plantation owner. May, desperate for some connection, would try to start conversations, asking about his day, about the trees, about the world beyond the narrow confines of their lives. Her questions were usually met with a noncommittal grunt or a terse, one-word answer. The first time he hit her, it was over a spilled cup of tea. She had been nervous, her hands trembling as she served him his evening meal. The cup had slipped, the hot liquid splashing across his bare chest. The shock of the heat was nothing compared to the shock of the blow that followed. It was a swift, open-handed slap that sent her stumbling backwards, the side of her face erupting in a fiery sting. He hadn't said a word, just stared at her with a cold, contemptuous glare before turning back to his food as if nothing had happened. May had spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of their sleeping mat, her body shaking with a mixture of pain and disbelief. That was the beginning. The physical violence was infrequent at first, a storm that would gather and break with little warning. A burnt pot of rice, a perceived slight, a day of low yield from the trees, any of these could be the trigger. But it was the psychological abuse, the slow, methodical erosion of her spirit, that was a constant, suffocating presence. He would mock her for her youth, for her stupid, childish dreams of one day seeing the city. He would belittle her in front of his friends, making crude jokes about her inexperience in bed. His words met with the boisterous, rum-fueled laughter of the other men. May learned to read the signs, to anticipate his moods. A certain tightness around his jaw, the way he would slam his tools down after a day's work, the heavy, deliberate tread of his footsteps as he approached the house, these were all portents of a difficult evening ahead. She became a ghost in her own home, moving with a quiet, almost fearful grace, her voice rarely rising above a whisper. She learned to cook his favorite dishes perfectly, to anticipate his every need, to make herself as small and as unobtrusive as possible. But it was never enough. The isolation of the plantation was a formidable ally in his campaign of terror. Their nearest neighbors were a half-hour's walk away, and the dense rows of rubber trees seemed to swallow all sound, creating a world where May's quiet sobs and Bao's angry shouts were absorbed by the indifferent green canopy. She had no one to turn to. Her family was a day's journey away, and she knew that even if she could reach them, they would likely send her back. A wife's duty was to her husband, they would say. She had made her bed, and now she must lie in it. The other women on the plantation, the wives of Bao's friends and fellow workers, were a closed circle. They were older, their faces etched with the hardships of a life of labor, their eyes holding a weary resignation that May was not yet ready to embrace. They would offer her sympathetic glances when they thought Bao wasn't looking, a fleeting touch on the arm, a whispered word of comfort. But they would never intervene, never speak out against him. They knew the rules of this world, the unwritten laws that governed their lives. A man's home was his castle, and what happened within its walls was his business alone. As the months bled into a year, the abuse escalated. The slaps became punches. The angry words became guttural roars of rage. He began to control every aspect of her life. She was not allowed to leave the immediate vicinity of their house without his permission. He would give her a small, pitiful amount of money for the weekly market and would demand a detailed accounting of every single coin spent. He became possessive and jealous, accusing her of looking at other men, of having impure thoughts. His accusations were as baseless as they were cruel, but he would not be reasoned with. One evening, a young man, a new worker on the plantation, had offered to help her carry a heavy basket of vegetables from the market. It was a simple, innocent gesture of kindness, but Bao, who had been watching from a distance, had seen it as a betrayal. That night, he had dragged her into the house by her hair, his face a mask of fury. He had accused her of being a whore, of shaming him in front of the entire community. He had beaten her until she had lost consciousness, her last waking memory the sight of his contorted face, his eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to have no end. She had woken up the next morning on the hard floor, her body a symphony of pain. Every muscle ached. Every breath was a struggle. She had looked at her reflection in a small, cracked mirror and had barely recognized the bruised and swollen face that stared back at her. It was in that moment, as she traced the outline of a split lip with a trembling finger, that something inside her began to shift. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in the pit of her stomach. But it was now mingled with a new and unfamiliar emotion, a slow-burning ember of rage. She began to fantasize about escape. At night, as Bao snored beside her, his body reeking of cheap rice wine, she would lie awake and imagine a different life. A life in the city, a life where she was free, a life where she did not have to live in constant fear. But the city was a distant, almost mythical place, and the path to it was fraught with 1,000 dangers. She had no money, no friends, no idea how to navigate the world beyond the rubber trees. The breaking point came on a hot, oppressive afternoon. The air was heavy with the promise of a storm, the sky a bruised and angry purple. Bao had been in a foul mood all day. The price of rubber had dropped again, and he had spent the morning cursing the traders, the government, the very trees themselves. He had come back to the house for his midday meal, his face dark with a silent fury. May had prepared his favorite dish, a spicy pork curry with bamboo shoots. She had taken extra care with it, hoping to soothe his temper. But as she placed the bowl in front of him, he had swatted it away, sending the hot curry splashing across the floor. "Is this what you call food?" he had roared, his voice cracking with a sudden, violent rage. "It's slop, fit for pigs. Just like you." He had grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You're useless," he had hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. A useless, stupid girl. My biggest mistake was marrying you. He had then pushed her to the ground, and as she lay there, stunned and humiliated, he had begun to kick her, his heavy work boots landing with sickening thuds against her ribs and her back. The pain was excruciating, but it was the look in his eyes that had truly terrified her. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look that said he wanted to destroy her, to erase her very existence. And as she lay there, gasping for breath, the world a kaleidoscope of pain and fear, she knew that he would not stop. That one day he would go too far. That one day he would kill her. The storm broke then, the heavens opening up with a deafening clap of thunder. The rain came down in sheets, a relentless, cleansing torrent. And as the water streamed through the leaky roof, mingling with her tears and the sweat of her fear, a cold, clear thought formed in her mind. It was a thought that was both terrifying and liberating, a thought that would change the course of her life forever. It was a thought that whispered, with a chilling and undeniable certainty, that if she wanted to live, Bao had to die. The rest of the afternoon was a strange, surreal dream. Bao, his rage spent, had gone back out to the groves, leaving May to clean up the mess. She had moved with a slow, deliberate calmness, her mind a blank slate. She had scrubbed the curry from the floor, her hands moving with a mechanical precision. She had washed her face, the cool water a welcome relief against her bruised and swollen skin. She had then gone about her evening chores, her body on autopilot, her mind a world away. As dusk began to settle over the plantation, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, Bao had returned. He was sullen and silent, his earlier rage having given way to a brooding resentment. He had eaten his dinner without a word, his eyes never once meeting hers. He had then drunk himself into a stupor, as he often did, and had passed out on their sleeping mat, his snores a low, guttural rumble that filled the small house. May had watched him for a long time, her heart a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest. The ember of rage that had been ignited that afternoon had now grown into a roaring fire. She looked at his sleeping form, at the slack, open mouth, the chest that rose and fell with each drunken breath. This man, this stranger who had become her tormentor, her jailer, her would-be murderer. This man who had taken her youth, her dreams, her very sense of self. She got up and moved with a silent, cat-like grace to the corner of the room where Bao kept his tools. Her eyes fell on the tapping knife, its long, curved blade gleaming in the dim moonlight that filtered through the open window. It was the tool of his trade, the source of his livelihood. It was also a weapon. Her hand closed around the cool, smooth wooden handle. Felt strangely heavy, strangely right. She walked back to the sleeping mat, her bare feet making no sound on the dirt floor. She stood over him, the knife held loosely in her hand, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She thought of her family, of their hopes for her, of their disappointment. She thought of the young man at the market, of his simple, unthinking kindness. She thought of the city, of the life she could have had, the life that had been stolen from her. And then she thought of the pain, the physical pain of his blows, the emotional pain of his words, the soul-crushing pain of her existence. And as she stood there, the tapping knife in her hand, the scent of latex and lingering fear in the air, she knew that she could not bear it any longer. She knew that she had a choice between a life of fear and a future of freedom, a choice between being a victim and being a survivor. She raised the knife, its polished blade a sliver of silver in the darkness. She looked down at the man who had been her husband, her abuser, her monster, and with a strength she never knew she possessed, she brought the knife down, plunging it deep into his chest, again and again, the rhythmic thud of the blade a counterpoint to the steady drumming of the rain on the tin roof, a final, desperate act of defiance in the heart of the rubber plantation. The scent of latex was now mixed with a new, coppery smell, the smell of blood, the smell of a bloody end to a bloody life. And in the ensuing silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and her own ragged breathing, May knew that her life, for better or for worse, had just begun. The rain continued its relentless assault on the tin roof, a chaotic symphony that mirrored the turmoil in May's soul. For a long time, she simply stood there, the tapping knife still clutched in her hand, its wooden handle sticky and warm. The coppery scent of blood was overpowering, a thick, nauseating perfume that seemed to coat the back of her throat. Below her, Bao lay still, his eyes wide open in a final, unseeing stare. The moonlight, filtering through the cracks in the walls, cast an ethereal glow on the dark, spreading stain on his chest. The world seemed to have shrunk to the confines of this small, dimly lit room. The past, with its endless cycle of fear and pain, had been brutally excised. The future was a vast, terrifying blank. There was only the present moment, a frozen tableau of violence and its immediate, bloody aftermath. May's first coherent thought was not one of guilt or remorse, but of a strange, chilling clarity. It was the clarity of a survivor, the cold, hard logic of someone who had been pushed to the very edge of their endurance and had found a way to push back. She knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as it was terrifying, that what she had done was not just an act of rage, but an act of self-preservation. It was a choice she had made, a bloody, irreversible choice, and now she had to live with its consequences. Her body, which had been rigid with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, began to tremble. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she stumbled to the corner of the room, her hand clasped over her mouth, and retched, the meager contents of her stomach spilling onto the dirt floor. The physical act seemed to break the spell that had held her in its grip. The world came rushing back in, the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs, the distant howl of a wild dog weaving themselves into the relentless drumming of the rain. She looked at her hands, at the dark, almost black, stains that coated her fingers. She looked at the knife, at the way the moonlight caught the droplets of blood on its curved blade. And then she looked at Bao, at the man who had been the source of all her misery, now reduced to a lifeless, broken thing on the floor. A scream built in her throat, a raw, primal sound of terror and grief, and 100 other emotions for which she had no name. But she choked it back, swallowing it down, knowing that silence was now her only ally. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her newfound clarity. What was she going to do? What would happen when the sun came up, when the world woke up, when Bao's absence was noticed? They would come looking for him. His friends, his fellow workers, the foreman of the plantation. They would find him, and they would find her, and they would know. Her mind raced, a frantic, desperate search for a way out of this new, self-made prison. She could run, disappear into the vast, unforgiving jungle that bordered the plantation. But she was a girl from a small village, a girl who had never ventured far from the familiar rows of rubber trees. The jungle was a place of legends and nightmares, a place of snakes and tigers and spirits that preyed on the unwary. She would not last a day. She could go to the police, confess what she had done, and throw herself at their mercy. But the police were men, men like Bao, men who believed in the sanctity of a husband's authority. They would see her not as a victim, but as a murderer, a cold-blooded killer who had defied the natural order of things. They would lock her away, and she would spend the rest of her life in a real prison, a place far worse than the one she had just escaped. No, there was only one option, one slim, desperate chance of survival. She had to make him disappear. She had to erase every trace of what had happened in this small, blood-soaked house. She had to become a widow, a grieving, heartbroken widow, whose husband had simply vanished without a trace. The idea, once it had taken root in her mind, grew with a frightening speed. It was a monstrous, audacious plan, a plan that would require a level of cunning and a strength of will that she did not know she possessed. But it was a plan born of desperation, and desperation, she was quickly learning, was a powerful motivator. The first step was to clean. She stripped off her blood-stained clothes, her movements quick and efficient. She found a clean sarong and wrapped it around her trembling body. She then took a bucket and a rag and began to scrub the floor, her hands raw from the harsh soap and the rough, uneven surface of the dirt. The rain, which had been her enemy just a few hours ago, was now her friend, its relentless downpour providing a plausible excuse for the dampness of the floor. She worked with a feverish intensity, her mind focused on the task at hand, shutting out the larger, more terrifying reality of what she was doing. She scrubbed until her muscles ached, until the coppery smell of blood was replaced by the clean, earthy scent of wet soil. She washed the tapping knife, scrubbing it with sand until it shone, until every last trace of its gruesome purpose was erased. She then placed it back among Bao's other tools, a silent, deadly secret hiding in plain sight. The most difficult part was dealing with Bao's body. He was a big man, his body heavy and unwieldy. She tried to move him, to drag him, but he was a dead weight, an anchor that threatened to pull her down into the abyss of her own making. For a moment, she was tempted to give up, to simply lie down beside him and wait for the inevitable discovery. But then she thought of his face, of the contempt in his eyes, of the pain of his blows, and a new surge of strength, a strength born of hatred and a fierce, primal will to live, coursed through her veins. She found a large, sturdy sack, one that he used to transport the raw latex. With a superhuman effort, she managed to roll his body onto it, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She then began to drag him, inch by agonizing inch, out of the house and into the rain-swept darkness. The plantation at night was a different world, a place of shifting shadows and strange, unfamiliar sounds. The rubber trees, which were so familiar to her in the daylight, now seemed like silent, accusing sentinels, their long, slender trunks like the bars of a cage. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was convinced that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were following her every move. She dragged him away from the house, away from the well-trodden paths, into the deeper, more remote parts of the plantation. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain, and the sack left a long, dark trail in the red earth. She knew she had to find a place to hide him, a place where he would not be found, a place where he would simply become a part of the rich, decaying tapestry of the jungle. She remembered a place, a remote corner of Bao's plot that he rarely visited. It was a small, overgrown ravine, choked with weeds and thorny bushes. The locals avoided it, whispering stories of evil spirits and bad luck. It was the perfect place. The journey to the ravine was a nightmare. The sack was heavy, and the terrain was treacherous. She slipped and fell several times, her hands and knees scraped and bleeding. The rain had plastered her hair to her face, and her sarong was caked in mud. She was no longer a young wife, a grieving widow. She was a wild, desperate creature, driven by a single, all-consuming purpose. When she finally reached the ravine, she was on the verge of collapse. Her body was screaming in protest, her lungs burning with every breath. But she could not rest, not yet. With the last of her strength, she pushed and pulled the sack until it tumbled over the edge, disappearing into the dark, tangled undergrowth below. She listened for the sound of it landing, but there was only the steady drumming of the rain. She stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, her body numb, her mind a blank. She had done it. She had committed the perfect crime. Or had she? The trail, the long, dark smear in the red earth, was a glaring testament to her guilt. She had to erase it, to smooth it over, to make it disappear, just as she had made him disappear. She found a fallen branch and began to sweep the ground, her movements frantic and clumsy. She worked her way back to the house, her eyes scanning the ground, her heart pounding with every step. She covered the trail with leaves and dirt, trying to make it look as if it had never been there. It was a futile, desperate act, but it was all she could do. By the time she got back to the house, the first faint hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The rain had finally stopped, and the air was cool and clean. She was exhausted, her body a canvas of aches and pains, her mind a fragile, shattered thing. She washed herself as best she could, scrubbing the mud and the blood from her skin, trying to wash away the memory of what she had done. She then put on a clean set of clothes and sat down on the sleeping mat, the very mat where her husband had died just a few hours before. She knew that the next part of her plan, the most difficult part, was about to begin. She had to become the grieving widow. She had to act her part, to convince the world that she was a victim, not a perpetrator. She had to cry, to scream, to tear at her hair, to put on a performance so convincing that no one would ever suspect the truth. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the plantation, she took a deep breath and let out a long, piercing wail, a sound that was not entirely feigned. It was a cry of grief, yes, but it was also a cry of fear, a cry of loneliness, and a cry for the innocent girl she had once been, the girl who had been lost forever in the bloody darkness of the previous night. Her scream echoed through the silent rows of rubber trees, a sound of profound and utter despair, a silent scream that was finally being heard. The neighbors were the first to arrive, their faces a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. They found her in a state of near collapse, her eyes red and swollen, her body racked with sobs. She told them a story she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times. Bao had been angry, she said, angry about the price of rubber, angry about the world. He had stormed out of the house in the middle of the night, in the middle of the storm, and he had not returned. They listened to her story, their expressions a mixture of pity and suspicion. They searched the immediate vicinity of the house, their voices calling out his name. But there was no sign of him. It was as if he had been swallowed by the night. The foreman was called, a big, burly man with a permanent scowl on his face. He questioned her, his voice sharp and accusing. Where had he gone? Had they fought? Was she telling them the truth? May stuck to her story, her voice trembling, her tears flowing freely. She was a picture of a distraught, abandoned wife, and her performance was flawless. A search party was organized, a group of men from the plantation, armed with machetes and sticks. They fanned out into the groves, their voices a chorus of shouts and calls. They searched all day, their efforts hampered by the thick, muddy ground. They searched the well-trodden paths and the remote, overgrown corners of the plantation. But they did not search the ravine. It was a place of bad luck, a place to be avoided. As the day wore on, a strange sense of unreality settled over May. She was an observer, a spectator in her own life, watching the events unfold with a detached, almost clinical, interest. She played her part to perfection, accepting the condolences of the other women, her face a mask of grief. But behind the mask, her mind was a whirlwind of activity, replaying the events of the previous night, searching for any mistakes she might have made, any detail she might have overlooked. By the end of the day, the search was called off. Bao was gone, vanished without a trace. The men gathered in small groups, their voices low and speculative. Some said he had run off to the city, tired of the hard life on the plantation. Others whispered of gambling debts, of enemies he might have made. And some, the more superstitious ones, spoke of the jungle, of the spirits that lurked in the shadows, of the dangers that awaited those who dared to defy them. No one suspected the truth. No one looked at the small, slender girl with the tear-streaked face and saw a killer. She was just a poor, unfortunate widow, a victim of circumstance, a woman to be pitied, not feared. That night, as she lay alone on the sleeping mat, the silence of the house was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The fear was still there, a constant companion, a cold, hard presence in the pit of her stomach. But it was now mingled with a new, unfamiliar emotion, a sense of power, a sense of control. She had faced her monster and she had won. She had taken a life, but in doing so, she had reclaimed her own. The road ahead was uncertain, a path shrouded in mist. But for the first time in a long time, it was her path to choose. She was no longer a victim, no longer a prisoner. She was a survivor. And as she closed her eyes, the image that filled her mind was not of Bao's dead, staring eyes, but of the city, a place of bright lights and endless possibilities, a place where she could finally be free. The red earth of the plantation had drunk its fill of blood, and in the silence that followed, a new, and infinitely more dangerous, life was about to begin. The days that followed Bao's disappearance bled into a week, and the week into a month. The initial shock and flurry of activity on the plantation slowly subsided, replaced by the familiar, monotonous rhythm of daily life. The search parties had long since been disbanded, their efforts yielding nothing but tired limbs and a growing sense of futility. Bao's name, which had once been a topic of constant, speculative conversation, was now spoken in hushed tones, as if he were a ghost who might be summoned by the mere mention of his existence. For May, life had become a strange and precarious balancing act. On the surface, she was the grieving widow, a tragic, sympathetic figure. She played the part with a quiet, understated dignity, her face a carefully constructed mask of sorrow. She would attend the small, informal gatherings of the other women, her eyes downcast, her voice a soft, mournful whisper. She would accept their offerings of food and their well-meaning, if somewhat clumsy, words of comfort. But beneath the surface, she was a prisoner of her own secret, a secret that was both a burden and a source of a strange, dark power. The small wooden house, which had once been her prison, was now her sanctuary. It was the only place where she could let her guard down, where she could be herself, or at least the new, unfamiliar person she had become. But it was also a place of ghosts. At night, when the plantation was cloaked in an inky darkness, she would be visited by the specter of her dead husband. She would see his face in the shadows, hear his voice in the creaking of the floorboards, feel his presence in the cold, empty space on the sleeping mat beside her. The fear was a constant, gnawing presence, a fear of discovery, a fear of retribution, a fear of the darkness that she had unleashed within herself. She would be plagued by nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams in which Bao would rise from his shallow grave in the ravine, his body covered in mud and leaves, his eyes burning with a vengeful fire. She would wake up screaming, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. But with each passing day, with each sunrise that did not bring the police to her door, a new, and infinitely more seductive, emotion began to take root in her heart. A sense of freedom. She was no longer a slave to Bao's moods, no longer a victim of his rages. She was the master of her own life, the architect of her own destiny. She could wake up when she wanted, eat what she wanted, and, for the first time in her life, she could dream. Her dream, her obsession, was the city. It was a place she had only heard about in stories, a place of towering buildings, of endless, bustling streets, of a million lights that turned the night into a second day. It was a place where a person could disappear, a place where a person could reinvent themselves, a place where a young widow from a remote rubber plantation could shed her past like a snake sheds its skin. But the city was a world away, and the path to it was fraught with obstacles. The biggest obstacle was money. Bao had been a man of modest means, and what little savings he had were hidden away, their location a secret that had died with him. May knew that she could not stay on the plantation forever. Sooner or later, the foreman would appoint a new worker to take over Bao's plot, and she would be forced to leave, to return to her family in disgrace, her future a bleak and uncertain landscape. She began to think like a survivor, like a predator. She knew that she had to be ruthless, that she had to seize any opportunity that came her way. Her opportunity came in the form of a man named Chun, a trader who would visit the plantation once a month to buy the raw latex. Chun was a man of the city, a man with a flashy smile, a quick wit, and a reputation for being a womanizer. He had always been friendly to May, his eyes lingering on her a little too long, his compliments a little too forward. In the past, she had been afraid of him, of his slick urban charm, of the way he seemed to see right through her. But now, she saw him not as a threat, but as a means to an end. The next time Chin visited the plantation, May was ready for him. She wore her best sarong, a simple but elegant garment of deep blue silk. She put a single, white frangipani flower in her hair. Its sweet, intoxicating scent a stark contrast to the ever-present smell of latex. She approached him with a boldness that surprised even herself, her eyes meeting his with a directness that was both alluring and unsettling. She told him her story, a carefully edited version of the truth. She was a poor, lonely widow, she said, trapped in a life she did not choose. She spoke of her dreams of the city, of her desire for a new beginning. She did not ask for his help directly, but her words were a subtle, seductive invitation, a promise of things to come. Chen was intrigued. He was a man who enjoyed a challenge, and the sad, beautiful widow with the haunted eyes was a challenge he could not resist. He offered her a ride to the city, a place to stay, a job in his small, family-run noodle shop. It was a generous offer, an offer that was pregnant with unspoken expectations. May knew what he wanted from her, and she was prepared to pay the price. Leaving the plantation was easier than she had expected. She packed her few belongings in a small, woven bag, her heart a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She said her goodbyes to the other women, their faces a mixture of envy and pity. They saw her as a fallen woman, a woman who was trading her virtue for a chance at a better life. But May did not care what they thought. She was a survivor, and survivors did what they had to do to survive. The journey to the city was a revelation. For the first time, she saw a world beyond the endless rows of rubber trees. She saw rice paddies that stretched to the horizon, their vibrant green a stark contrast to the dark, monotonous landscape of her former life. She saw villages teeming with life, with the sounds of children laughing and vendors hawking their wares. And then, she saw the city, a sprawling, chaotic metropolis that rose from the plains like a concrete and steel jungle. The city was everything she had imagined and more. It was a sensory overload, a cacophony of sounds, a kaleidoscope of colors, a dizzying whirlwind of human activity. It was a place of a million stories, a million dreams, a million heartbreaks. And as she stepped out of Chen's truck and onto the hot, crowded pavement, she felt a thrill of fear and exhilaration, the thrill of a person who was about to be reborn. Her new life was not easy. Chen was a demanding and possessive lover, his affection a suffocating, cloying thing. The work at the noodle shop was hard and tedious, long hours of chopping vegetables and washing dishes in a hot, steamy kitchen. But it was a life of her own choosing, a life that was a world away from the fear and violence of her past. She learned to navigate the city, to understand its rhythms, to speak its language. She shed her village accent, her simple, homespun clothes, her demure, downcast gaze. She became a city woman, a woman with a sharp tongue, a quick mind, and a hard, protective shell around her heart. But the ghost of the rubber trees was not so easily banished. It would visit her in the dead of night, in the quiet moments between the chaos of her new life. She would see Bao's face in the crowds, hear his voice in the shouts of the street vendors, feel his touch in the possessive embrace of her new lover. The past was a part of her, a dark, indelible stain on her soul. One day, a man came into the noodle shop, a man from her village, a man who had known Bao. He did not recognize her at first, so much had she changed. But as he looked closer, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, May's blood ran cold. She knew that her carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down around her. She fled, disappearing into the anonymous, teeming streets of the city. She became a ghost, a nameless, faceless woman, moving from one menial job to another, from one cheap, run-down apartment to another. She was a fugitive, a woman on the run from her past, a past that was always one step behind her. Years passed. May's youth faded, replaced by a weary, haunted beauty. The city had taken its toll on her, its relentless pace and its casual cruelty etching lines of sorrow and experience on her face. She was no longer the innocent girl from the rubber plantation, nor was she the ambitious, ruthless woman who had seduced the traitor. She was something in between, a survivor who had paid a heavy price for her freedom. One day, as she was reading a newspaper, a small article caught her eye. It was about a remote rubber plantation, about the discovery of a human skeleton in an overgrown ravine. The police were investigating, the article said, but the remains were old, and identification would be difficult. May read the article again and again, her hands trembling. The ghost that had haunted her for so long had finally been given a name, a form, a tangible reality. The past, which she had tried so hard to outrun, had finally caught up with her. For a long time, She sat there, the newspaper clutched in her hand, her mind a blank. The fear, which had been her constant companion for so long, was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The secret that she had carried for so long was no longer hers alone. It was out in the world, a story waiting to be told. She did not know what the future held. Perhaps the police would find her, and she would have to pay for her crime. Perhaps she would continue to live in the shadows, a ghost in the city of dreams. But as she looked out of her small, grimy window at the endless, indifferent cityscape, she knew one thing for certain. She was a survivor. She had faced the darkness, both within and without, and she had endured. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The rubber plantation had turned bloody, but in the heart of a young wife, a fierce and unbreakable will to live had been born. And that, in its own tragic, terrifying way, was a kind of victory.